I have seen a lot of things in 31 years behind that bench. I have seen guilty men weep and innocent men stand perfectly still. I have seen the law work exactly as it was designed to, and I have seen it catch things it was never meant to catch. But there is one morning I keep coming back to, a Tuesday in November, cold, gray, the kind of morning that sits heavy on the chest before you have even had your first cup of coffee. A boy walked into my courtroom, 14 years old, jacket 2 sizes too big, sneakers held together with tape. He stood at that stand and he did not look up. Not because he was hiding something, but because he had spent enough years learning that looking up at adults in positions of authority rarely ended well for him. The charge was shoplifting. $11.50, 3 sunflowers, and a sprig of lavender. Now, I have seen shoplifters in every shape and size. I know what that particular kind of guilt looks like when it walks through a courtroom door. And I am telling you, what I saw in that boy was not guilt, it was grief. But I did not know that yet, not in those first minutes. In those first minutes, all I knew was that the file in front of me said guardian of record, the state. 4 words, the loneliest 4 words in the English language. When I finally asked him why he took those flowers, what he said next silenced every single person in that room, including me, and I have not stopped thinking about it since. Before we begin, drop a comment and tell me where in the world you are watching from and what time it is where you are. And if stories about justice, empathy, and hidden truths move something in you, make sure you are subscribed to this channel. You are going to want to be here for what comes next. There are cases that walk into your courtroom and never fully walk out. I have been a judge for 31 years. I have sat behind this bench through heat waves and snowstorms, through murder trials and parking disputes, through the best and worst of what human beings are capable of doing to one another and to themselves. I have heard confessions that kept me awake for weeks. I have signed sentences that I replayed in my mind for months afterward, turning them over like stones, checking what lived underneath. In all that time, I have developed what my clerk once called, with some affection, an unreliable heart. She meant it as a compliment. She meant that I had not yet learned to leave the cases at the door when I went home at night. I took that as the finest thing anyone has ever said about me in a professional capacity. But there is something I have learned, something that took me far too many years and one particular loss to understand, and it is this: the law is a net. It is a wide, necessary, imperfect net, cast across the chaos of human behavior to catch what would otherwise destroy us. And it catches almost everything it should. But sometimes, not often, not as a rule, but sometimes, the net catches something it was never meant to catch. Something small and fragile and bewildered. Something that does not belong there. On a Tuesday morning in November, in the 31st year of my tenure on this bench, the net brought me a boy. The courthouse that morning felt like the inside of an old lung. Cold, gray. The kind of cold that does not come from temperature alone, but from light, or the absence of it. The windows were fogged at the edges. The overhead lights in courtroom 4 buzzed with that particular low frequency that I have always associated with official places where people do not want to be. The radiator in the corner hissed and clicked but produced no warmth that I could feel. My clerk had placed a cup of coffee on the bench before I entered. I wrapped both hands around it and did not drink it. I simply held it. Some mornings that is the closest thing to comfort a courtroom offers. The gallery was sparse. A Tuesday in November rarely draws a crowd. There was a woman in the second row on the left, mid-50s, an apron still tied around her waist over a faded floral blouse, as though she had come directly from wherever she had been standing before someone told her she needed to be here. She sat with her purse on her lap and her hands folded over it, and her expression was the carefully arranged expression of a person who had arrived angry and was now beginning, against her will, to feel something else. Across the aisle sat a man I recognized as the caseworker from St. Michael's, the state-run shelter 2 miles east of the courthouse. He had a manila folder. He did not open it. He just held it and stared forward, the way people stare when they already know the story and are not sure they want to hear it told out loud. And then the door at the side of the courtroom opened. He came in walking slightly ahead of the officer escorting him, not out of confidence, but out of the particular way children move when they are trying to take up as little space as possible. He was 14 years old, though he looked younger. The leanness of him, the narrowness of his shoulders, the way his face still held the soft, unfinished quality of a boy who had not yet grown into whatever man he might become. His jacket was gray, a zip-up with a broken zipper held closed by a safety pin near the collar. 2 sizes too large. His jeans were clean but thin at the knees. His sneakers were white once, probably a long time ago, and the sole of the left one had separated slightly at the toe and been pressed back with what looked like packaging tape. His hair was uncombed. Not styled, uncombed. There is a difference. Uncombed hair on a teenage boy in a courtroom means no one checked before he left. No one said, "Here, let me fix that." No one was there to say it. He took his position at the stand and he looked at the floor. Not nervously, not in the shifty way of someone concealing something, but in the particular way of a person who has learned, through long practice, that the floor is a safe place to direct your eyes. The floor does not look back. The floor does not judge. The floor simply holds you up and asks nothing in return. I looked at him for a long moment before I said a single word. The courtroom was silent except for the buzzing of the lights and the distant percussion of the radiator. I thought about my son. I thought about a Tuesday morning 12 years ago when I stood in a cemetery in the rain and could not make myself leave. I thought about how grief does not announce itself, how it finds you in the most ordinary moments. A cup of coffee, a gray morning, a boy standing very still with his eyes on the floor. I set down my pen. "Ethan," I said. He looked up. There is a particular sound that a courtroom makes when a charge is read aloud. It is not the sound of the words themselves. It is the sound of the room receiving them. The almost imperceptible shift in posture, the small collective intake of breath, the way the air seems to compress slightly, as though the walls themselves are leaning in to listen. I have heard that sound thousands of times. It never becomes ordinary. The prosecutor that morning was a young woman, capable, precise, the kind of attorney who reads every line of a file and trusts the file completely. She stood and she read from the document in front of her with the clean, uninflected delivery of someone who has learned that emotion in an opening statement is a liability. The charge was shoplifting. 3 sunflowers, 1 sprig of lavender, removed from the outdoor display rack in front of Holloway's flower shop on Elm Street at approximately 8:17 in the morning on a Friday. The surveillance footage, which the prosecutor noted was available and clear, showed the defendant approaching the display, selecting the items with deliberate care, and exiting without paying. Total value of goods taken, $11.50. $11.50. I have heard that number many times since that morning, in the quiet of my own mind, and every time it lands the same way, like a pebble dropped into still water, small, but the rings go outward for a long time. The prosecutor finished reading and sat down. The courtroom settled back into its silence. The fluorescent lights buzzed. The radiator clicked. I looked at the charge sheet in front of me. I looked at the name printed at the top. Ethan Cole. D.O.B. September 3rd, 14 years old. No prior record. Current residence listed as St. Michael's Youth Shelter, 440 Renner Avenue. Guardian of record, the state. Guardian of record, the state. I have read that designation hundreds of times in my career. It is 4 words. It is also, if you allow yourself to think about what it means, really means, one of the loneliest sentences in the English language. I set the sheet down. The boy was still looking at the floor. His hands were clasped in front of him at the waist, the knuckles pale. At some point during the reading of the charge, his left foot had turned inward slightly. A small, involuntary contraction, the body doing what the mind tries not to do, folding toward its own center for protection. The prosecutor had presented her case with efficiency and correctness. She had done her job. The evidence was real. The act had occurred. The law was clear. Everything about the formal machinery of that courtroom was functioning exactly as it was designed to function. And yet, I have spent 31 years learning to listen to the "and yet." The defense, a public defender who looked as though he had already read the file and understood it, carried more weight than its 11 pages suggested, rose and made a brief statement. Ethan had no prior offenses. He was a minor. He was a ward of the state. He had cooperated fully with the officer who detained him. He had not run. He had not argued. He had, by the officer's own account, handed the flowers back without being asked, and then stood quietly on the sidewalk and waited. Handed the flowers back without being asked. I wrote that down. I do not always write things down during preliminary statements. I wrote that down. The public defender sat. The room waited. Outside, somewhere beyond the frosted windows, a car moved slowly through the gray November street. The radiator knocked twice and went quiet. I looked at Ethan Cole. He had not moved. He was still looking at the floor, still holding himself together with the particular stillness of someone who has learned that stillness is its own kind of armor. But I could see from where I sat the slight tremor in his jaw, the way he was breathing, slowly, carefully through his nose, the way a person breathes when they are fighting very hard not to cry in a room full of strangers. I have a theory about people who cry in courtrooms. There are those who cry because they are afraid of the consequences, and there are those who cry because they are carrying something that has nothing to do with the charge sheet in front of them, something older and heavier and far more real than $11.50. You can tell them apart if you pay attention. The first kind of tears are loud. They come fast and they fill the room. The second kind are the ones people try to hold back. They come from somewhere deeper. They are the kind that once they start do not stop easily. Ethan Cole was trying very hard not to shed the second kind. I folded my hands on the bench. The caseworker from St. Michael's shifted in his seat. The woman with the apron, the owner of the flower shop, I now understood, had stopped looking at the boy and was looking instead at the middle distance, the way people look when a feeling arrives that they were not expecting and do not yet have a name for. I cleared my throat. There are moments in a courtroom when the legal proceeding and the human situation diverge so completely that you must make a choice about which one you are actually presiding over. The law will always give you a framework. It will never give you the answer. The answer, the real one, lives in the space between what happened and why it happened. And in 31 years, I have found that the why is almost always the only part that matters. I leaned forward slightly. "Ethan," I said. His eyes came up from the floor and found mine. Brown eyes, tired, careful. The eyes of someone who had taught himself long ago to expect very little from adults in positions of authority. I held his gaze. "I'd like you to tell me something," I said, "and I want you to take your time. There's no rush in this room." The lights buzzed. The clock on the far wall moved its second hand with a soft, mechanical tick. "Why did you take those flowers?" He didn't answer right away. That is the thing I remember most clearly. Not the words that eventually came, but the silence before them. The particular quality of it. It was not the silence of someone calculating. It was not the silence of someone deciding how much to reveal or how to shape the truth into something more favorable. It was the silence of someone who had carried something alone for so long that the act of being asked, of being genuinely, quietly asked, required a moment just to absorb. I waited. The clock ticked. The lights buzzed. Somewhere in the back of the gallery, someone shifted in their seat, and the old wood groaned softly beneath them. Then Ethan Cole lifted his chin, just slightly, and he spoke. "My sister," he said. His voice was low, careful, the voice of someone testing the structural integrity of each word before placing weight on it. "Her name was Lily. She died 8 months after my parents. Pneumonia." He paused, swallowed. She was 9 years old. The woman in the apron, Margaret Holloway, pressed her fingers to her mouth. "Tomorrow is 1 year," Ethan continued, "since she died. I go to the cemetery every month. I always bring something. Even if it's just a leaf or a branch or something I found. I always bring something." He stopped again. His jaw moved. She liked sunflowers. She always said they looked like they were trying to see over a fence, like they were stretching to look at something just out of reach. I did not write anything down. I simply listened. "And the lavender," he said, and his voice dropped even lower. She used to say lavender smelled like heaven. She had never smelled heaven, but she was sure that's what it was. She was very sure about things like that. The tremor in his jaw was visible now. His hands, still clasped in front of him, had tightened to the point where the color had left his knuckles entirely. "I asked at the shelter if I could have a few dollars. They said they couldn't do that. I collected cans for a week. I got $3. The flowers were $11.50. He took a slow breath through his nose. "I know what I did was wrong, I know it, but I couldn't let her not have flowers, not on the 1 year. I couldn't let that day go by like it was nothing." And then he stopped. Not because he had finished. I could see that he had not finished. He stopped because the thing he was holding back, the thing he had been holding back since he walked through that door, since he stood on that sidewalk and handed the flowers back without being asked, since 8 months after the fire when he became the only coal left, finally became too large to hold. He wept. Not loudly, not with the theatrical abandon of someone performing grief for a room. He wept the way people weep when they have been strong for too long, and a single moment of genuine human attention has finally dismantled the architecture of their composure. His shoulders curved inward. His head dropped slightly. The tears fell straight down from his face to the floor of the courtroom, and he did not raise his hands to wipe them because wiping them would have required acknowledging them, and he was still, even now, trying to take up as little space as possible. I removed my glasses. I set them on the bench in front of me, and I pressed my fingers against my eyes for a moment. Just a moment. And I thought about a cemetery in the rain, and a stone with a name on it, and the particular weight of standing next to someone's absence and not knowing what to do with your hands. I put my glasses back on. The courtroom was absolutely silent. The prosecutor was not writing. The public defender was not writing. The caseworker from St. Michael's had set his manila folder on the seat beside him and was staring at the boy with an expression I can only describe as the look of a man confronting something he should have already known. Margaret Holloway was crying quietly in the second row. I looked at Ethan Cole for a long moment. He had straightened slightly, the instinct toward dignity reasserting itself even through the grief, and he was looking at me now with the red-rimmed, exhausted eyes of someone who has just set down something very heavy and is not yet sure whether that was a relief or a mistake. I spoke slowly, each word deliberate. "Ethan, I want you to listen to me carefully, because I am not going to repeat this, and I want you to carry it with you for the rest of your life." He held my gaze. "You are not a thief. A thief takes because he wants. You took because you loved. Those are not the same thing. The law cannot always distinguish between them. The law is not built for that kind of precision. But I can. And I am telling you as clearly as I know how to say it. What you did on that sidewalk was not a crime. It was an act of devotion. And the world does not have nearly enough of those." I let that sit for a moment. "But I want to say something else." I leaned forward. "When we are in pain, real pain, the kind that doesn't go away in the morning, we sometimes convince ourselves that we are alone in it, that no one would understand, that asking for help would be pointless or shameful or simply too much to ask of a world that has already taken so much from us." I paused. "That is a lie, Ethan. It is the most convincing lie that grief tells, and it is still a lie." He blinked. A single tear ran down the side of his face and disappeared into the collar of his oversized jacket. "There were people in that shelter, on that street, in that flower shop, who would have given you those flowers freely if you had knocked on the right door. The tragedy is not that the world failed you. The tragedy is that no one made sure you knew which doors to knock on. And for that," I said, and I felt the weight of the institution I represented settle over my shoulders like a second robe, "this system owes you an apology, not a verdict." I picked up my gavel. The charge against Ethan Cole is hereby dismissed, in its entirety. The gavel came down. Thud. One clean, final sound. And then the courtroom exhaled, all at once, as though the room itself had been holding its breath since 8:17 on a Friday morning, when a boy picked up 3 sunflowers and a sprig of lavender and carried them toward the only person he had left to love. I watched him stand there for a moment after the gavel fell. He did not move immediately. Children who have spent enough time in institutional settings, shelters, waiting rooms, offices where adults make decisions about their lives, develop a particular habit of waiting for explicit permission before they do anything. They learn through repetition that moving before you are told to move is the kind of thing that causes problems. So Ethan Cole stood at the stand and waited, even after the dismissal had been read, even after the room had begun to stir around him, until the officer near the door gave him a small nod and he understood that it was over. He took one step away from the stand. Then he stopped. He turned back toward the gallery. Margaret Holloway was already on her feet. I have thought about that moment many times since, about the particular geometry of it. A 58-year-old woman crossing a courtroom floor toward a 14-year-old boy, still wearing her apron, her eyes red, moving with the purposeful, slightly breathless energy of someone who has just made a decision and is afraid that if she slows down, she will lose her nerve. I thought about how she reached into her purse and produced a small white business card and placed it into the boy's hand. How she closed both of her own hands around his for just a second before she let go. I could not hear what she said to him from the bench. I did not need to. I watched his face as she said it, the careful, guarded face of a boy who had learned not to expect things. And I watched something shift in it. Something careful and protected gave way, very slightly, the way ice at the edge of a river gives way when the temperature finally turns. Not all at once, just at the edges. He looked down at the card in his hand. Then he looked up at me. I gave him the smallest nod I could manage without losing my composure entirely. He walked out of the courtroom holding that card with both hands. That was 4 years ago. I kept tabs on the case, informally, the way judges are not supposed to but sometimes cannot help. I asked the caseworker from St. Michael's, a decent man named Gerald, to keep me loosely informed. Not in any official capacity, simply as one person asking another, "How is the boy doing?" The first report came 6 weeks after the dismissal. Margaret Holloway had hired Ethan to work Saturday mornings at the flower shop. Light work, sweeping, arranging the outdoor displays, helping with deliveries. She paid him in cash and let him take home whatever hadn't sold by closing time. He brought what he could to the cemetery on Sundays. The second report came 8 months later. Ethan had saved enough, between his shelter allowance and what Margaret paid him, to commission a small brass plaque for his sister's grave. He had chosen the inscription himself. Lily Cole. She said lavender smelled like heaven. Gerald told me that when the stonemason installed it, Ethan sat beside it for 2 hours. He brought sunflowers. He did not cry, or if he did, no one was close enough to see. The third report came 2 years after that. Ethan had aged out of the shelter system at 16 and Margaret Holloway had spoken to a different judge in a different courtroom, who helped facilitate a guardianship arrangement. He was living in the small apartment above the flower shop. He had enrolled in the local high school. He was, by all accounts, quiet and serious and extraordinarily good with plants. He had a particular gift, Margaret told Gerald, for knowing which flowers were about to die and which ones just needed more time. I thought about that for a long time when Gerald told me. I thought about how some things that look finished are not finished. How some things that look like endings are simply intervals. How a boy who had lost everything, parents, sister, home, the soft, ordinary infrastructure of a childhood, had ended up through a chain of events that began with $11.50 worth of sunflowers and lavender in a room above a flower shop, tending living things, learning which ones just needed more time. I do not know what Lily Cole would have made of all of it. She was 9 years old and she believed that lavender smelled like heaven and that sunflowers were trying to see over a fence. She was, by all accounts, a child who was very sure about things. I think she would have been sure about her brother. I think she would have been sure that he was going to be all right. I think she was right. I retired from the bench 14 months ago. My last day in Courtroom 4, I sat for a few minutes after the building had emptied. Just sat, in the silence, with the lights off and the November gray coming through the fogged windows. And I thought about the cases that never fully walked out. I thought about the ones that stayed, the ones that taught me something I did not know I still needed to learn. I thought about Ethan Cole. I thought about the particular sound a courtroom makes when the right thing happens. It is quieter than you would expect. It is not a cheer or an applause or even a collective exhale. It is something closer to a held breath released. The sound of a room remembering for just a moment that it was built for something more than procedure. The law is a net. It catches almost everything it should. But the law is not the last word on what a person deserves. The last word on that belongs to the rest of us. To the woman who crosses a courtroom floor still wearing her apron. To the caseworker who keeps a folder he never needs to open because he already knows the story. To every person in every ordinary position who has the power on any given Tuesday to look at someone the system has caught and ask a simple question. Not what did you do, but why? The answer to that question, the real answer, the one people give when they believe someone is actually listening, is almost always the beginning of something. It was for Ethan. It can be for anyone. If this story stayed with you, take just a moment and ask yourself something honest. Have you ever been so alone in your pain that you convinced yourself no one would help? So you carried it all by yourself, when you didn't have to? Have you ever almost judged someone for what they did before you knew why they did it? And is there someone in your life right now, someone quiet, someone who never asks for anything, who might be standing at their own kind of stand, waiting for someone to simply ask the right question? Share your thoughts in the comments. We read every single one. And if you believe in stories about compassion, second chances, and the kind of justice that remembers there is a human being behind every case number, then this is your channel. Subscribe, and we will see you in the next case. Court is adjourned.